Okay, good morning, people. Let's see who we have here. So Thika's here. Good morning. Monica's here. Morning, Monica. Good morning, Baha. Good morning, Mashid. Good morning, Karen. Good morning, Manish. Manish is feeling 100%, it looks like, this morning, or some variant of that. KC is here. Good morning, KC. Good morning, Erica. Um, yeah, so we'll give people a few minutes to trickle in here. How are you guys feeling this morning? If you're in Vancouver, you'll notice that it's kind of a little bit cloudy and a little bit rainy outside. It's kind of, right? But that's okay. How are you feeling? I think are we in week 6 now? Is it week 6? Hi, Jenna. How are you feeling? How are you feeling in week 6, emoji wise? How are you feeling in week 6? I'm gonna see if I can find an emoji that works for me. Yes, we are. Are you feeling it, Baha, or are you? I don't know. I can't find an emoji that sums up my feelings for week 6. I can't find one. Baha's emoji's kind of like so, like right? Duong, good morning, Duong. Casey, oh okay, Casey's emoji's having a little party. Karen's emoji is still asleep. That's okay. That's okay. So what we'll do today, people, is this. We'll talk just a little more about Indigenous Canada and Indigenous people's experience in Canada. Good morning, Ivan. Good evening, Ivan. We'll talk a little bit more about that. We'll talk very quickly about the article that we read yesterday about the ongoing effects of genocide in Canada. We'll talk about that a little bit. And then we'll talk about we'll talk about Indigenous people today. I'll say this again later, but I'll also say it now. One of the things that we need to remember, especially, well, we all need to remember when we're learning about Indigenous people in Canada, is that there is a lot of history to learn and to know and to understand, but it's also important for us to remember that these people still exist, right? And Indigenous people are still living in Canada today with us in Vancouver, in other cities, and they are part of modern life. And so it's important that we learn about history, but we don't think about them as the historical view of themselves. They're a modern people, sort of integrated into our cities and into our cultures, and they're trying to find their way just like everyone else is. And so so I have a I have a little video to show you that that talks about that and helps show how Indigenous people are kind of living in the present rather than how they were living hundreds of years ago. Okay, so we'll talk about that, but first let's dive in here. Okay, so we of course were talking about the role that race has played in the construction of Canada, and we said of course that the relationship between Indigenous people and Canadians and the Canadian government has been pretty dysfunctional. There have been lots of awful things that have happened, mostly with the Canadian government to blame, as the Canadian government is the one who has been in power for 150 years. But the results of that relationship, the legacy of that relationship, is quite clear to see when you look at some statistics in Canada. And so if you look at the employment rate, so who has jobs and who does not, Indigenous people are less likely to be employed. They are their after-tax incomes are usually lower. Their educational outcomes are poorer. Um, if you look at the Human Development Index, we see that First Nations people living in Canada are 33rd in the world. And so, again, it's almost as if they're living in a different country within our own country, okay? The poverty rate for Indigenous people and for people of color is generally greater than for other races and ethnicities. In prison, we see that a pretty substantial proportion of the population that's in prison are Indigenous people. And even though they represent a very small percentage of our population overall. And so I'd like you to look at that statistic in the middle of the slide there, where it says that Indigenous men make up 3% of the population in Canada and 26% of the population in prison. Okay, so that's a red flag, right? That's something needs to be explained here. That doesn't happen by accident. Okay, and again, we talked about mental health outcomes as well. We said that suicide rates among Indigenous communities are often much higher, 5 to 6 times, or sometimes 10 times as high. And in some communities, there are high rates of drug and alcohol use as well. And when you mix these things in with poorer access to housing, to clean drinking water, to other infrastructure like internet, when you look at their differential access to education and to health, when you put that in the context of a society that still holds a lot of racism and discrimination toward Indigenous people, it's a pretty uncomfortable and toxic environment for these people to be living in, right? And so, again, research has shown that there are a lot of negative outcomes. I'm just going to jump back here. There are a lot of negative outcomes that we see in the Indigenous community, and many of those have to do with the history of what's happened to these people, right? What's happened has been incredibly traumatic, and it's happened for generations. And again, you can't the effects of those things don't end with one generation. They continue to echo through, and so they're more complicated to repair, and they take longer to repair. Good morning, Jimmy. So that brought us to, oops, I'm going to jump here. That brought us to the question of genocide, right? And so we read that article yesterday on genocide, and within the article it talked about the Genocide Convention. So that was passed by the UN in 1948 after World War II, and after all of the information about the Holocaust came out and people understood what happened there. The UN passed a declaration explaining what genocide was. And so what they said was it was the systematic harm or killing of members of a certain national or ethnic or racial or religious group, deliberately imposing living conditions that seek to bring out its physical destruction in whole or in part, preventing births, or forcibly transferring children from one group to another. Okay, and so we read this article, The Ongoing Legacies of Canadian Genocide, and I had asked you to determine the argument of that paper, and we struggled a little bit. But I think part of the reason that we struggled a little bit is because I think I misinterpreted the argument in that paper. I think it was a little bit different and a little bit simpler than originally I thought it was. Okay, and so what I would like to do, if you wouldn't mind, is I would like to just answer that question. I would like to answer that question again and see what we come up with, because I think I think I did it wrong. I think the argument that I suggested to you yesterday is not what the argument is. And so let's try it again, okay? So what did we say was the author's conclusion? And I think I still believe that this is correct. So what we said the conclusion was yesterday, I think is still the conclusion today. But what did we say that it was? What did we say that it was? Come on, guys, you remember, right? You're not like Dory in Finding Dory, where you forget everything really quickly. Come on. There we go. Okay, so Casey says genocide can still be seen today. Okay. Genocide is still a problem. Okay. What else? Good for both of you for jumping in there, but let's have more. No problem, Banamere. Someone said there's a genocide. Who said there was a genocide? Where? Against whom? The effects of genocide have continued until today. Oh, you weren't calling me Mikey on purpose? Okay. Okay, we're in the ballpark here. We're in the ballpark. So I think this is what we agreed yesterday. And again, I still think this is the conclusion. Oh, why didn't it pop up? Hang on. Something weird's going on here. Okay. Oops, came up twice. So I think that's the conclusion that we came up with yesterday. So Canada's treatment of Indigenous people should be understood as a genocide. Okay. Some people say no, some people say yes. The thing that this author wants us to believe is that what's happened to Indigenous people in Canada, we should see that as a genocide. Okay. So I think we agreed on that yesterday. I think we got there. Now, why should we believe that? That's the question. So as critical thinkers, this author is going to say what happened in Canada over the past several hundred years, and maybe even is still happening today, that should be considered a genocide. We should ask the author, why should we believe that, right? What evidence do you have? And so how does she prove to us that this is a genocide? That's the argument. How does she demonstrate to us that we have a genocide on our hands? Karen says, okay, so many people were intentionally or unintentionally killed. Okay, so that happens, right? That happens in a genocide. Also happens in a war or in a natural disaster. So, but people were killed for sure, and that's part of the picture here. That's part of the picture. But what else? The author says this is a genocide, and we should ask this author, why should we believe you? What evidence do you have? Yes, and so Mashid, I said that yesterday. I said intention doesn't matter, and it's true. The author says that, but I don't know that it's part of it. I don't think it's a main part of the argument. And again, I think the argument is more simple than I thought it was. Okay, so if the author says that this is a genocide, the first step is to know what a genocide is, right? And so I think a premise of this argument is this. I think a premise of this argument is that the United States passed a convention on the prevention and punishment of the crime of genocide in 1948. So there is a list. Whoops. Oh, maybe it's too long. Give me a second here. Okay, maybe what I'll do is I'll put it up on the screen because I can't fit it in here. This is kind of what I'm thinking here. So, Canada's treatment of Indigenous people should be understood as cultural genocide. And so, why should we believe that? Well, I think she's making the argument that this is what genocide is. So the first premise tells us what genocide is. The second premise says that the Canadian government did many of these things, right? So she says the treatment of Indigenous people in Canada is a genocide. One of her premises is that this is what a genocide is, and the Canadian government has done all of those things, right? It's almost, I think this argument is almost similar to the one that we talked about. You know, when Joseph was taking the bus, do you remember that one? And the argument was that Joseph is always late when he takes the bus. Today he's taking the bus, and so today he's going to be late, right? So the conclusion there was we were being asked to believe that Joseph was going to be late today. Why was he going to be late? Because he's late every time he takes the bus, and today he's on the bus. And so we have a similar kind of argument here where Indigenous people have been subjected to genocide in Canada. Why should we believe that? Well, this is what genocide is. This is what you have to do in order to do a genocide. And the Canadian government has done those things. Okay, so I think I was a little bit off track yesterday, and I think I suggested the wrong argument, but I think this is what it is. It's actually, the argument in this paper is quite a bit more simple than I thought it was. And so here she's just saying, you know, there's some controversy over whether we should call this a genocide. She says we should call this a genocide because this is what you need to do to have a genocide, and the Canadian government has done a bunch of those things, right? And so I think it's a much more simple argument than I originally thought it was, and I think I was wrong yesterday, the way I thought that it was. But I think this is a more accurate statement of what Pamela is trying to argue. And then, of course, she goes on to explain how some of these things are, or how Indigenous people are still discriminated against, and how these problems persist. And then she goes on to suggest what should be done, right? So what should we do about it? What should Indigenous people do about it? So she kind of carries on from her argument and talks about other things, but I think, to my mind, to my eyes, this makes more sense in terms of what Pamela is actually arguing for in her article. So, does that make sense? Now, I apologize if I confused you yesterday with an argument that wasn't quite right. But again, I think it's better for us to fix it rather than to just ignore it. So, does that make sense? Do you see how she is making that argument in the paper? Thumbs up, thumbs down. Yes, with a Z. Good. Okay, so you see that? Yes, okay. So, let's see. So Karen's a thumbs up. Okay. Vika, okay. Erica, okay. So Duong's good. Yeah, and I think when we talked yesterday about intention, in terms of you don't have to, your intention doesn't matter and your success doesn't matter, I think those points were connected to what you see on the screen here under Article 2, right? So Article 2 says that genocide is the intention to destroy, but Pamela is kind of pushing the idea that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you intend to or not, right? It doesn't matter if there is a grand plan to try to destroy these people, or if it happens in a bunch of different ways, the end result is still the same. So I think that's why the author talks about intention, because I think she is addressing that point right there where it says the intention to destroy, and Pamela is saying your intention doesn't matter. If you destroy a group of people, a targeted group of people, then you destroy them and it's a genocide. It doesn't matter what you meant to do. That's kind of what she's saying there, I think. Okay, but there's more questions. There was more questions that I wanted to ask you. So, number 2, why might people want to reject this argument? So now that we actually know what her argument is, why might people want to say no to Pamela? Why might people want to say no? This isn't a genocide that we've had in Canada. It's a bunch of bad stuff, but it's not a genocide. Why might people want to disagree with Pamela? Why might they say no? Because this is an important critical thinking skill too, right? Not only to understand the argument that someone's making, but also to understand how people might see things differently. So Karen says, Canada has been promoted as an equal and discrimination-free country. That's true, right? Canada, we like to brand ourselves, right? Our brand is multiculturalism and diversity and acceptance. And so this story, and specifically talking about genocides, does not fit with how we like to see ourselves and how we like to brand ourselves. So how we promote ourselves to the world is not a complete picture of who we are or who we were, right? There's more to it. What else? Why else might people disagree with her argument? Why might people want to say, no, Pamela, I think you're wrong. I think you're crazy. I don't think we should talk about this. Erica says, because it's not obvious and difficult to see. Yeah, that's part of it as well, right? If you know anything, and I think you probably do, if you know anything about World War II and the genocide against Jewish people during the Holocaust, you will know that was a very well-planned, efficient mechanical genocide, right? There was a very clear plan to eliminate these people. Here in Canada, it seems to be less clear. There's lots of, there's laws and disadvantages and things that aren't that great. And, sometimes things are quite awful, but sometimes it's not as clear, right? It's kind of a fuzzier picture. It's not as obvious of a genocide as something like what happened in Nazi Germany or Rwanda or so forth. Why else might people want to disagree with her? Why else might people want to disagree with her? Well, let's see here. Here's some of the things that I was thinking about. First of all, I was thinking that genocide is a very powerful word, right? It has a lot of negative connotations to it. If you don't know that word connotation from English class, and it was not taught in school. Yes, we'll come back to that in a second, Karen. Connotation and denotation. So what a word denotes, what its denotation is its actual meaning. So if I say rat, its denotation is the little furry rodent, right? That's what the word denotes, rat. But if I call someone a rat, there's a connotation, and the connotation is negative, right? To call someone a rat, that's not a compliment, right? That's the word rat has a negative connotation that way. Okay, so denotation is what something actually is. Connotation is kind of the feeling around that word. Okay, and so if you say someone is, a peach or a bunny or something like that, that has a positive connotation, right? It's a nice thing to say. If you say someone's a rat, that has a negative connotation around it, right? It has negative feelings attached to it. And genocide is one of those words that has negative connotations, right? It's very powerful. People don't really like to think about it. It makes them upset. And so the idea that something like that happened here in Canada may cause them to push that away, right? To disagree immediately because it's such a strong word, right? Because it's such a powerful word. They might reject this argument because they might not understand what genocide is. And so that kind of speaks to Erica's point there, because it's not obvious and difficult to see, right? So people might think that genocide is just killing everybody in a single group. And because that hasn't happened in Canada, they might think that we don't have a genocide, right? So that's a good point there. The other point I want to bring up here is privilege, okay? And so we talked about privilege in terms of the opportunities or advantages that one group in society gets over another, okay? And in this case, the way that privilege works is that non-Indigenous Canadians, particularly white European Canadians, this is something that they are able to ignore. They can choose to ignore this because the disadvantages and discrimination and racism that Indigenous people face in Canada can be ignored by white Canadians if they want, right? And this is something that happens with all dominant groups because the dominant group isn't the target of racism or sexism or religious oppression or whatever it is. They don't have to engage with it. They don't have to pay attention to it. They don't have to agree that it exists because it doesn't really affect them, or at least not directly anyway. So part of it might have to do with privilege, right? People are just like, oh, I don't want to deal with this. I don't want to deal with this question. It's too much, right? And they can ignore it. For Indigenous people, this is a harder thing to ignore because it impacts their life and their lived experience, right? Non-Indigenous Canadians might have their feelings of power or dominance challenged by this idea. And so this actually kind of goes back, this is actually, I think, connected to Karen's point, where we've been promoted as an equal and discrimination-free country, right? And we Canadians like to feel good about ourselves because of that. And to some degree we should. I mean, we have things to celebrate here. This isn't an awful country. It's overall it's a pretty good country. But there are bad things that we have to acknowledge, but some people might not want to do that, right? Some people might want to hold on to the view that us Canadians are good and we like different cultures and we like diversity, and in many ways that's true, but there are other things that we need to address. And so some people might not want to let go of the idea, like Karen mentioned, that we are an equal and discrimination-free country, which one day I hope we will be, but we're not yet. And the last one is that non-Indigenous Canadians might experience guilt or anger. Again, no one wants to feel that they have been associated with a genocide, right? And so this might actually be the strongest reason why people might reject Pamela's argument, is because it threatens their identity. It threatens who they are, right? If I agree with Pamela Palmater, if I agree with her article and I say, yes, we have had a cultural genocide here in Canada, if I agree with her, that means that I'm part of a country, I'm part of a group of people that has benefited from a genocide, right? And that's gross, right? That's a gross feeling. And so many people don't want to think about that or accept it. And so they might reject Pamela's article or argument, sorry. They might reject her argument, not because they're thinking critically and they have, disproved her argument. It's because they're having an emotional reaction because they don't want to be associated with a genocide. And to some, that's understandable, right? Nobody wants to be associated with that, but it doesn't mean that Pamela is wrong. Okay, what about this one here? Consequences. We talked about this when we talked about critical thinking as well, right? Because we said that our beliefs, the things that we believe, have consequences, right? If we accept a belief or if we reject it, that will change the way we see the world. It'll change the choices we make. And so, what are some of the consequences of believing this? If Canadians read this article and Canadians say that, yeah, I think she's right. I believe her. I think we have had a genocide here in Canada. What might be some of the consequences? What might come from that if we choose to believe her argument? What are some of the consequences of that? What might happen if Canadians believe what Pamela is saying? What might happen if people believe this? What changes could we see? Karen said they would they would wake up and okay. So they would wake up and smell the coffee. Karen, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit for you here. So you're saying that people would actually accept and understand what's happened to Indigenous people in Canada, right? They would sort of open their eyes to what's happened to Indigenous people in the past few hundred years and to some of the things that are still happening today, right? Okay, what else? So people might wake up and smell the coffee and figure out what's going on, but then what? Then what? Then nothing? Oh yeah, we had a genocide, okay. Cool. Not cool. But then what? There's 14 people. You all have fingers and thumbs as near as I can tell. Yeah, they might feel guilty, right? That's true. People might feel uncomfortable and upset. They might feel angry. They might feel guilty. And all of those things are okay, right? All of those things are okay. That is part of the process of all of this, is dealing with all of those feelings. You can't repair what's happened in the past without feeling those negative feelings. Okay, so the negative feelings are okay. We need to get past them eventually, but they're okay in the short term. Okay, what about bad image? Okay, it could hurt our it could hurt our image, right? Us Canadians like to present ourselves a certain way. We want to be, in the global community, we want to be liked. We want people to like us and think that we're friendly and polite, which mostly we are, I think. But it might harm our international image. It might affect what people think of us. I don't know. Is it affecting what you think of us now? Because all of you are part of the global community, right? So does it change the way you see Canadians now? Do we have a bad image? Do you think we're all awful? Don't want to answer that one. Okay, so what are some consequences of not? Baja. Another war might occur due to people wanting to change bad history. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly possible that this knowledge creates bad feelings and conflict, right? I would argue that wars don't change history; they just add to it. But yeah, conflict is possible, right? Casey says the problem's not solved. Yeah, so you can't fix something. If something is broken, you cannot fix it unless you identify that there's a problem in the first place, right? If you don't admit that something's wrong, you can never fix it, right? So the first step is pointing out where something is wrong, right? And again, I think that's part of why some people in the United States are so frustrated when, and in Canada, when people step in front of a microphone and say that there is no systemic racism, right? Because again, how can you fix systemic racism? How can you solve it if you actually don't admit that it exists in the first place? And the answer is you can't. And so, yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking too, is that the problem with not believing something like this is that nothing really changes, right? So, yeah, if you believe what Pamela Palmater says, then you can take steps to solve the issue, but you can't fix a problem that you don't acknowledge. And so if people don't believe it, we just have more of the same, right? Nothing gets fixed. Indigenous communities still continue to struggle. Us white Canadians try to ignore it and go about our lives. Nothing changes, right? And so that's not, for those of us who want, for those of us who care about other human beings, and for those of us who want equity and equality within society, that's not acceptable, right? So we have to acknowledge the problem in order to fix it, right? fourth question I asked you was, what does the author suggest that we can do to reconcile this relationship? Oops. To reconcile this relationship. So that's good, right? Because she's just identified that this problem has happened. We have an issue. How can we solve it? How can we solve this problem? How can we solve this problem? So Karen says, so part of it is understanding the past, right? Admitting to and understanding what has happened in the past. And again, 20 or 30 years ago, we weren't even there, right? Because a lot of the stuff that I've just told you about, a lot of the stuff that I've just taught to you was not taught to me when I was younger. And so, 20 or 30 years ago, we weren't even there. We weren't even at the point of admitting what kind of things had happened. So at least we have made steps forward in talking about this stuff. So yeah, we can admit the wrongs that have been committed. We can work toward an equal future, right? And what does that look like, I wonder? How do we do that? How do we create an equal future? If you had an answer for this, I would be very impressed, because this is one of those things that is super complicated, and there is no one answer for it, and everybody, it's gonna take a long time and a lot of work to figure out. But I guess the last question is this one: has Pamela made her case? Do you agree with her? Do you agree that we have had a genocide or a cultural genocide in Canada for the past few hundred years, but just one that's been kind of somewhat disorganized and somewhat quiet, and somewhat inefficient? But have we had one? Is Pamela right? I think this might be an answer to the earlier one, but that's okay. Yeah, this is an important thing, and actually it's a critical piece of the puzzle, I think, Karen, is education, right? Teaching kids from a very young age what has happened in their country, right, and why things are the way they are. Yeah, okay, that's no problem. Yeah, that's an important part of this question here, is to how do we reconcile the relationship between these two groups? Well, education is a critical part, right? If people don't understand what happened, then they won't understand why things are the way they are now, and they won't understand why things need to change, right? So education is critically important. But then to my last question, do you agree? I'm going to assume that's the answer for that question, maybe, Karen. Yeah. Casey says yes, because it's the only way to solve the issue that it should happen. Yeah, the only way to fix a problem is to first identify what it is, right? And so, we've had something awful happen here, and it is not the fault of Indigenous people, right? It's not. There's nothing wrong with them or their culture. They have just been pushed aside and brutalized by governments in the past, right? And so that needs to be fixed. Yeah. Okay. I was going to say something else, but I think maybe I'll maybe I'll save it for a few minutes. Okay, let's take a 10-minute break, and then when we come back, um, if you have any questions about that article, you can ask them. We'll do a quick review, and then um, we'll talk about this very question. We'll talk about, or not whether you agree, but what what can be done. Where where are we in this? Um, where are we in this relationship? What are things like, and what kind of things can we do to make a better future for us? Okay, so take a quick break, stretch your legs, come back here, and then we'll talk about what is to be done. Okay, so see you in just a bit. Okay, and we're back. So, where are we? Finished reading that article. We, I'll take responsibility. I screwed up the argument. We fixed the argument, I think. And I think we've at least accepted the fact that Pamela is arguing that we've actually had at the very least, a cultural genocide within Canada. And so the Canadian government has attempted to destroy the lifeways of these people in order to create the country that we have. And again, it's a difficult and delicate and nuanced situation. And so maybe I'll take a second to talk about this here, and I don't know if this will be helpful or not. But often, what we see in the news today is an attempt to see things in black and white, right? An attempt to see things as right or wrong, good or bad, black or white, and nothing in between. And the problem with doing that in many cases is that it's a very complicated situation, right? And so here we have a group of people who have been marginalized, minoritized, and brutalized for quite some time. And so something clearly has gone very wrong, and Canada needs to learn about that and understand it and accept it and commit to changing it. But does that mean that Canada is a horrible country? No, right? Canada is actually a fantastic country. It's not a perfect country. There are lots of things that we need to work on. There are things that need to change. There are injustices. There are things that go wrong here every day. And so we have to keep working. But just because something bad happened to one group of people doesn't necessarily mean that the other group are the villains, right? And so sometimes I think you see this with what's happening in the States. Sometimes you see it in other contexts, which we'll try to highlight as we go forward. But most of these situations are much more complicated than good guys and bad guys. And so again, we have a situation in Canada that needs to be rectified. It needs to be fixed. Lots of things happened in the past that were wrong and destructive and unethical. But our job now is to fix it, right? To go from where we are and to fix it. Because again, it's not a simple good guys, bad guys kind of situation, okay? But anyway, I wanted to say that for however helpful it might be. Okay, so we've gone through all of these. And so again, the legacy of this relationship is that First Nations communities are, in many cases, battling with poverty, with drug and alcohol abuse, a lack of education, poor housing, poor infrastructure, and racism and discrimination. Now, this is not to say that, again, this is in terms of like black or white, good or bad. Not every Indigenous person is living this kind of life, right? There are all kinds of different experiences that Indigenous people have in Canada, depending on all kinds of different factors. And so some people are doing really rather well, some people are not. Some people live in very poor conditions, some people do not. And so we're making a generalization here about what Indigenous lives are like, but that's not the reality for all Indigenous communities, but it is the reality for some. Okay? So, where do we go? How do we reconcile this relationship? How do we fix this problem? So a couple things have happened that have moved us along the path to reconciliation here, okay? So a number of years ago, I guess about 12 years ago, they created the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, and it was targeted at the experience of people, of Indigenous children in residential schools. And so part of what this commission did was it went all across Canada, and it held these big open meetings where anyone could come and speak. And so people who had attended Indian residential schools, people who had relatives or family members that had been to Indian residential schools could come forward and could speak, and they could be heard. Okay, and so everyone was able to sort of tell their stories of what happened to them and what happened to their parents or their relatives, and the commission would listen. The commission would take notes, and everyone could hear. And then at the end of that commission, and as you can see, it went on for quite some time. It was only finished in 2015, so it was a long process. At the end of that, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission identified 94 calls to action. And so this is a list of 94 things that Canada needed to do in order to mend this relationship between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous Canadians based on this Indian residential school history. I would love to be able to tell you that all 94 have been addressed and we've done them all. The sad news is that we haven't. But there have been some steps forward. A few steps forward. So again, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission itself is a step forward, right? People got to tell their stories, people got to be heard, and for many Canadians, this put the education, the knowledge of Indian residential schools in front of people's faces. And so many people who hadn't really heard about them or didn't really know about them heard about them because of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So that was an important step toward educating people. In 2012, we had an Idle No More movement. And so this was a movement that was started to push for Indigenous rights and sort of self-determination. So it was kind of an empowering movement that started in 2012. I think it's kind of lost momentum now. I'm not really sure what's happening with it. But it was a step forward, right? The Indigenous people were advocating and protesting for themselves. Again, we saw the final report from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission at the end of 2015. Justin Trudeau had committed to implementing all 94 recommendations. Sorry, Justin, that hasn't quite happened yet, but hopefully we're working on it. There have been a few others here. Maybe I'll just leave some of these. If the August 28th one, if you want to look, Carolyn Bennett, the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs, was given the long-term task of ending the Indian Act and transferring certain government powers back to Indigenous peoples. And so that's important, right? We said that the Indian Act was created as a tool of assimilation against Indigenous people, and it was created without their consent. They had no input in the creation of this law. And so Carolyn Bennett is supposed to be in charge of taking apart the Indian Act and eventually giving those powers back to Indigenous people. Where she's at with that, I'm not really sure, but she was given that task. I guess we'll see. In October 6, 2017, we saw a pretty massive settlement to 60s scoop survivors. And so we didn't talk about the 60s scoop. Again, I told you that this was a very short history of Indigenous people in Canada and that we were skipping lots of things. The 60s scoop refers to, as you can see, the forced removal of Indigenous children from their homes and their adoption into predominantly non-Indigenous middle-class families. And so what was happening is that in many cases there were situations where families were experiencing domestic violence or drug and alcohol abuse. Provincial government authorities came in to remove the children for their safety, but then they placed them with white families rather than with other Indigenous families. And so that damaged people's culture as well, right? Because these children were suddenly raised outside of their own culture. But again, there was a pretty big financial settlement, as you can see, which again is a step forward. And finally, in June of 2019, we had a report returned by a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And so this report was in response to a pattern of violence where Indigenous women and young girls were far more likely to go missing and far more likely to be murdered in Canada than really any other group. And so Indigenous people for quite some time were calling for the government to take action, to figure out why this is happening and how can we stop it. And so finally, the government launched an inquiry, and as you can see, they gave 231 calls for justice. To my knowledge, I'm not sure where we are with all of those. I suspect not much has happened yet, I'm afraid to say. But anyway, what I talked about at the beginning of class is I said that it's important to remember that as we learn about the history of Indigenous people, that these people don't live in museums. They're not part of the past. They have a past, but they are peoples of the present. And sometimes they dress in, their traditional ceremonial clothing, which, like, how awesome do these guys look? Amazing. Most of those designs, by the way, are beadwork, and so they're all embroidered beads that make up those colored patterns, which is just absolutely phenomenal. So sometimes people, dress up in their traditional ceremonial clothing, but most of the time they're walking around cities looking like you and me, living their lives like you and me. And so again, it's important that we know that they are modern people living alongside the rest of us. They're also the fastest growing population in Canada. And so even though Indigenous people make up only 3% of Canada's population, that percentage is growing. And so there are going to be more Indigenous people as we move forward. And so there is a necessity and an opportunity to repair this relationship with Indigenous people. And so I wanted to show you this. This is a multi-part series that was made by CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. We'll just watch the first one, but the rest of them are really good too. And it talks about a little bit about the history of Indigenous people, but much more where Indigenous people are today. How are they living in Canadian society? What are they doing? What are their struggles? What are their triumphs? It's a very interesting and optimistic kind of look at what's happening for some Indigenous people within Canada. So here's what I'll ask you to do. Oh, sorry, one more thing. And it's hosted by this guy. This guy's Wab Kinew. He is an Indigenous person, an Indigenous Canadian. He's got kind of an interesting background. He was born in Winnipeg, Manitoba, I think. He was a musician for a while. He was a rapper, and then he was a broadcaster. So he worked for, I think, CBC, and he did some radio and television. University administrator. Now he's leader of the NDP in Manitoba, and so he's had quite an interesting career. But he's going to be the host of this little documentary. So just so you know who he is, he seems like a pretty cool guy. I have 6 questions for you, and I will post them in. I'll post this and the link for the videos in Microsoft Teams in just 30 seconds. So here's what I want you to do. There'll be 2 videos in Microsoft Teams, a really short one and a long one. The short one gives a summary of what's happened in Canada in terms of Indigenous people in the last few hundred years, and Wab Kinew does a much better job summarizing it than I did because he's cooler than I am. So it's just a couple minutes. Watch the first video, then start watching the second video. And the questions are from the second video, okay? Where are we here? 20. Okay. Let's watch 15 minutes. Let's watch the first 15 minutes of this video. Try and answer the questions that are in that 15 minutes. Then we'll come back here at about, what's it going to be, 20:30, about 9:35 or so. We'll come back here at 9:35 and maybe we'll try and answer a couple questions, okay? So watch we'll come back here in 20 minutes. So watch 15 minutes of the second video. We'll come back here in 20 minutes. I hope that makes sense. And then we'll talk about it. Does that make sense? Watch the first video, watch 15 minutes of the second video, come back here in 20 minutes. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? Anybody? Anybody out there? Where is it? It's on, I just posted it on Microsoft Teams, Baja, so 2 videos, just watch 15 minutes of the second video. Casey's good, Masheed's good, Karen's good. Okay. Let's, all right, I'm gonna turn you loose. Go watch the first video and 15 minutes of the second video, and then we'll come back in 20 minutes, okay? All right, see you in a bit. Okay, people. Hopefully you're back. Hopefully you're here. Um, Quick question. So we just watched. We watched the short video that Wab Canoe took us through. A very brief history of Indigenous people in Canada. Again, he did a much cooler job of it than I did. But then we went on to the second part, the Eighth Fire documentary. And so, what did you kind of see in that video? What was your kind of first reaction to um, what you saw? Okay, so informative and entertaining. Okay, that's good. I think it was both those things. Baha said, I was not expecting a bad look from settlers toward Indigenous people. Yeah, it's true. There is. We'll answer one of the questions here, but just before the video ended, that woman Lee Maracle said it. She said that Canada was founded on the negation of Aboriginal or Indigenous people. So the Canadian government and other Canadians looked at Indigenous people as less, right? As primitive, as backwards, as not intelligent, and they were dehumanized that way, and that's what allowed settlers to take from them without feeling bad, right? Us humans generally don't like to hurt other humans, and so a lot of genocide and sort of extreme racism and violence and things like that require you to dehumanize other people, and that's what Lee is saying. She's saying that these people were seen as less than human in some ways, and that enabled people to take things from them and to feel okay about looking down on them or seeing that their lives are damaged. So, but yeah, not expecting a bad look from settlers. Yeah, but it's true. And those sort of racist stereotypes and racist attitudes are, I think, decreasing, but they're definitely still around. Thika says the type of pattern that exists around First Nations people. Yeah, well, those are the stereotypes. Those are the stereotypes around First Nations people for sure, Thika. And again, like most stereotypes, there is a grain of truth. First Nations communities disproportionately have problems with drug and alcohol abuse. And again, it has to do with the traumatic experiences that they've had for hundreds of years in this country. But again, sometimes, just like we saw in Jane Elliott's class with the blue-eyed kids and the brown-eyed kids, sometimes these stereotypes and prejudices start to cycle back on each other. They start to feed back. And so if you tell the blue-eyed kids in the class that they're not as good and they're not as smart, they start acting not as good and not as smart. And then when they write their test scores are lower. And then when somebody looks at the test scores, they say, oh, the blue-eyed kids aren't doing very well. They must not be as smart, right? And so sometimes the prejudice starts to inform the reality, and then the reality looks like it supports the prejudice, right? And so you look at the test scores and you say, oh, look, it must be that blue-eyed kids are not as smart. And no, that's not true at all. It just looks that way because of the prejudice that you infused into these kids. And it's the same thing here. You see some of the stereotypes start to reflect back because some of them are true, a grain of truth anyway, and some of them, the evidence starts to support the prejudice. You know what I'm saying? And so, yeah, there's definitely stereotypes around this, and certainly there is drug and alcohol and substance abuse problems in some First Nations communities. Recently you meant, okay. Yeah, those, unfortunately, those stereotypical and prejudicial ideas are still, are alive and well, unfortunately. And again, it's, in part, it's because many communities are still struggling. Many Indigenous communities are still struggling with things, and so they are, it's an open wound. It's something that's still not fixed yet. Okay, so I'm going to. This is the only question we'll deal with today because we don't have a whole ton of time. But what are some of the stereotypes that exist surrounding First Nations people? And so, Thika, you had a few of them here. The sort of laziness thing, the alcoholism and drug addiction. Those are other stereotypes that get attached to Indigenous people. What else? What other stereotypes do we hear about or do we see? Yeah, so Karen says, so there's, problems with drug addiction, that comes up a lot. The don't pay taxes thing comes up a lot. It is not true. There are different income tax rules. I believe, I'm no expert in this. There are different income tax rules for Indigenous people who live on their traditional reserve and who make their money on their traditional reserve. But for most Indigenous people, that's not really possible. The reserves are far, far out of town, and there's really no way to make money there anyway. So most Indigenous people work off reserve, and if they do, they pay taxes just like you and me, just like everyone else. But that tax thing is still a stereotype. People don't understand. People think Indigenous people just get all kinds of free money from the government, and it's just not really the case. That they're not so smart. That they're members of gangs, right? And that they're criminals. And so, again, not always, but sometimes there's a grain of truth to some of these things. And so are some Indigenous people addicted to drugs? Yeah. Are some of them addicted to alcohol? Yes. Do some of them, are they members of gangs? Yes. Right? So there's always, not always, but sometimes there's a little sliver of truth, or even a bigger sliver of truth, to some of these stereotypes. But then, of course, when someone sees an Indigenous person who is, who has a drug problem or who is part of a gang, it reinforces their stereotype, right? They think that all Indigenous people or all Indigenous kids are gang members. They see an Indigenous kid who's a gang member, and then that reinforces their stereotype, right? It's a confirmation bias thing, and we talked about this a few weeks ago. Yeah, so there's lots of stereotypes about Indigenous people. Most of them are negative, but some of them, and I'm not sure if you caught it, this is the last thing I'll say. Some of them are actually positive. There's the stereotype of the noble savage, and this is what I forget the man's name, but the artist, the cartoon artist and the comic artist, he was saying there's also this noble savage stereotype too. So the First Nations person as this kind of, really buff, really fit, really perfect, yet innocent, child of the woods kind of thing. And they're sort of innocent and pure and, one with nature kind of thing. And he says that's kind of a tempting stereotype, and it's not a negative one, but it still reduces them. It still flattens Indigenous people to one thing, and they're not just one thing. So we see a lot of negative stereotypes around Indigenous people. Sometimes we see some positive ones as well, but stereotypes are stereotypes, right? They reduce people to a very simple, caricature of what they are. Whew, okay, so we've got more to talk about, obviously, but that's all the time we have. So good work today. I'm glad we sorted out that argument from yesterday, and I'm sorry I botched it, but sometimes that happens. Sometimes we screw things up, so we just have to fix them. So that got fixed, and I'm glad we started watching this documentary. I think it's going to be interesting. There's more to come. We'll meet Kent Monkman tomorrow. who actually was just in the news a little while ago, but we'll deal with that tomorrow. So I'll sign off for now, and I'll see some of you in just a few minutes in comparative cultures, and for the rest of you, I'll see you tomorrow. Okay, so bye.